Okay, let's talk about exit counselling if you've experienced a cult. And we'll talk about why exit counselling might help for other circumstances as well. Exit counselling is sometimes known as deprogramming. Deprogramming sort of began with people like Ted Patrick, who, in his community, he noticed there were quite a few people who had joined a particular cult. I think it was Children of God cult. And he came up with this idea that, people had been programmed by the cult. So computer programming was popular in those days. And so he came up with the idea of deprogramming people, sort of a reverse process of what the cults did. Exit counselling, a more evolved version. So rather than just focusing in on what a cult teaches necessarily, or sort of finding the hypocrisy of the leaders, exit counselling is more of I guess it takes longer, exit counselling, but it's sort of making sense of why you got involved with the cult, how you were vulnerable to a cult, what the cult did, and how to recover from a cult experience and move on with the rest of your life. hopefully. Now, you can read books, you can watch stories from ex-members, you can make sense of it. I mean, for me, my experience with the cult began in 1995, and it ended in 2015. 20 years is a big chunk of life to have a certain sort of worldview of, a spiritual worldview of things, how things are, or how it affected my life. Now, everybody has their own story. Everybody has a set of reasons why they were attracted to a friendly group of people, and everybody has their reasons why they left, and everybody has their way of making sense of what happened. Now some people they just bury it. They bury it in the past, and it's something. I mean, for me, I'm sort of more technically minded. I want to pick apart what happened, hence I do these videos, and make sense of it. And I think my making sense of it hopefully helps other people who do want to pick apart, what was this cult experience I went through. Um, I mean, for me, the last time I went to a sort of ICOC type service was roughly about 10 years ago. Maybe, I can't really remember. I might have gone once since then, but as soon as I became an atheist, it kind of poisons the well to go into some kind of church service. And one thing I've noticed with myself and other people that I've helped is once you change your worldview from sort of this religious worldview, or a more intense religious worldview of, we're saved, everybody else is lost, it's mission orientated, we've got to save the world. Once that's out of your mind, you really can't get anything from going to any kind of church once you're an atheist. It's quite a funny experience, really, because I've got a friend, and he's quite religious. He still goes to church, and sometimes I've gone along with him to his Catholic mass, but I just don't get anything out of it. I don't get anything out of it. It's a feeling, it's a fantasy, and I know it's a feeling, and I know it's a fantasy, and my worldview now. This is important to know, like how somebody's worldview can make them vulnerable to a cult, multi-level marketing, these self-help gurus, all the different type of scams out there. Your worldview and the way you think the world is can make you vulnerable to the con artists, and then if you go down that path, it's a sort of dead end path, of it's like, okay, I go to church on a Sunday, I see my friends at church, and it's your routine, and you never sort of look at it from a point of view of, hang on a minute, is what I believe accurate, or is what I'm doing a delusion? And when I think back to how I was vulnerable to a cult, it's really not very complicated. I left uni. I left most of my friends at uni, let's say. Everybody went their own way. People got different jobs. People travelled to different cities, and you don't tend to see them again, do you? It's like work. If you've lost your job or got a new job, you don't tend to see the people from your old office or your old university. You might have one or two friends that you carry on, but you're in a new situation. Now, the new situation I was in after 3 years of university was I could use some friends. I made some friends at work, but there's work friends and then there's sort of other friends. I didn't have a girlfriend, so I was vulnerable to that. And I've shared my story many a time, but the person who invited me, they were friendly, they were slightly pushy, and I went along on the Sunday to the church service. They were friendly, and they were trying to get me on board with God's kingdom, right? And because I wanted friends, and because I hadn't really focused on spiritual things, so I was vulnerable spiritually, and I was vulnerable socially. Now some people, they might be trying to come off drink or drugs or sexual immorality or whatever, and they find this friendly bunch of people, say, oh, we'll help you, we'll sort your life out, we'll give you purpose. And it doesn't necessarily matter what the cult is or what the group is. Cults sort of pick people up and sort them out and then send them out to save the world, kind of thing. If it was only that simple, if it was only genuine, normal Christianity. Now, I've had friends who, they had issues with drinking. They got involved with Alcoholics Anonymous, a legitimate, genuine organisation, and they got off the drink. And it's changed their life for the better. But, a cult can fix people up, using, common techniques of getting people off drink or drugs or whatever, right? But then they exploit those people and victimise those people who they've helped. Whether it's, now you've got a group of friendly people, that's nice. You think you've got the spiritual answers as to what life's all about and a purpose, evangelise the world, Matthew 28:19 and all of that. You think you've found, this is from God, suddenly my life makes sense, right? Suddenly you've got friends. Suddenly you've got a routine where, I think for a lot of people who go to cults, they make friends in these groups, and it at first glance, it can seem like a good thing. But then there's all the greed, there's all the pressure to recruit people. And of course, with Bible-based type cults, there's the indoctrination, that teaches you can't go anywhere else to be saved, and all of that kind of abusive stuff. And once you see it for what it is, you can't unsee it. There's a saying, once you've figured something out, it's like, right, a cult makes sense to me now. And cults and their agendas and the way their leaders are, for me, it's been a long journey out of the cult, but it makes sense. It makes sense that we live in a world of, unfortunately, there's a few serpents in Eden. There's a few dodgy cult leaders on planet Earth, and it is what it is. It is what it is, and a lot of people, I actually said to myself yesterday, right, I'm only going to add videos to this channel once a week, but I wake up. England won the football against Mexico. I'm happy about that. 3-2. So I thought, oh no, and sometimes you've got something on your mind and you just have to share it, So that's why I do these videos talking about exit counselling and deprogramming. And the goal of exit counselling and deprogramming, as I said earlier, is to make sense of what happened and to recover and to move on. Now, you can do both at the same time, kind of thing. I'm learning some more electronics. I've got a friend. We want to sort of start a company, so I'm doing that. And I'm also doing this, and I do other things in life. But it is a case of sometimes people just need a little bit of time out. You need an hour to research cults. What happened to me. Let's look at these other ex-members' stories. A lot of ex-members' stories aren't necessarily geared to, helping you. It's somebody who's come online and they've shared their story, right? I share my story, but I do realise that, it is also a case of helping people pick apart the cult process so you can avoid it in the future. I say this because, I got recruited into a cult. I was there for 20 years. I left the cult, but I was actually vulnerable to being scammed. And, when I left the cult, I got scammed by a Forex guru. I came out of the cult sort of quite traumatised, sort of shunned in a way as well. And I thought, well, I haven't been working for a while. I better get my act together. Get a job. And then I kept on seeing these adverts and these Forex gurus, and back in the day, 2016, binary options. I don't say, I'm sure there's still adverts out there for binary options and Forex and crypto. But, there's so many con artists out there. There's the religious con artists that are the cults. But then there's these, I don't know why social media just tolerates these dodgy adverts with these scammers. So I was vulnerable to that because I thought, oh, okay, I can take a course, I can give this guru some money, and I can sort my life out and make money, right? And the truth is, with multi-level marketing, 95% of people achieve nothing. With it, they just lose money. All these self-help gurus, typically the high 90% of people gain nothing from giving some guru $1,000 or £1,000 or whatever. Most people achieve nothing. And so there's a lot of people out there that will say they've got the spiritual answers to life, they've got the financial answers to how to make you successful. And a lot of these things are very cultic and very deceptive. You know, one of my friends, he said, "Oh, have you heard of this guy? You know, he's one of these self-improvement type gurus. You know, you take his course and he'll fix your life, stop you procrastinating, you know, the type, you know, make you successful, you know, shows you all these videos of people, oh, I turned my life around, you know." But what you notice with a lot of these scammers is you can actually pick it apart, you know, and people will say they're successful when they're not. You know, there's cult members who will give their testimony of how the cult has turned their life around, but actually it hasn't. You know, and we live in a world where there is a lot of BS. BS standing for belief system. You know, yeah. There's a lot of people who believe in their gurus, in their cults, in their make-believe deities, and that is their life. That is their life. They are addicted to self-help, but they might achieve nothing in life. They're addicted to going to church and fellowship, and they think they're helping each other, but you know, they're going nowhere in life. Really, I mean, is fellowship good? Sure. It's nice just to chit chat with friends. How's your life going? Human beings are social. But, you know, with deprogramming and exit counselling, you might see the world in a very different way. You know, now, you want to avoid being negative, you know, pessimistic, skeptical, nihilistic. You know, what's the point of anything? Well, you're here and you're alive, so find something to do. You get these nihilistic people, you know, and it's like, oh, what's the point of anything? Well, you sound like a really boring person, Mr. Nihilist. You know, try something, you know, get yourself a hobby. You know, try something, you know, some people like movies, some people like books. You know, for me, I like electronics, I like computer programming, I like computer games. You know, just get on with something that you like. You know, obviously a lot of people, they have to work. So, you know, learn a course, a proper course, not a dodgy course, and get a job and get on with life. You know, and a lot of people get stuck in a rut. You know, I know for me, one of the issues is I do procrastinate. I do, you know, I do enjoy listening to people like T. Harv Eker, Tony Robbins, Brian Tracy, but, you know, you listen and you think, well, hang on a minute, I've listened to it, I enjoy it, it's given me a lift, like going to a church service or whatever, but life doesn't change. You know, life doesn't change. And, you know, I think that this is an awareness that a lot of people sort of come to. It's like, well, I've tried a lot of things. I tried church. I tried the nightclub. You know, I tried drugs. I tried self-help. I tried work. You know, just keep on try, you know, eventually you'll get there. You know, and a lot of people I know personally who have had a cult experience, it has completely knocked the stuffing out of them, you know, and a lot of people are sort of traumatized by it. And yeah, they don't achieve in life what they might have achieved in life because of the cult. Yeah. And for me, what I realise is sometimes there's a time to rest and there's a time to recover, but then there's a time to do something with your life. And it's very easy to, I mean, a lot of people I know who have experienced the cult and they keep working, you know, they've got a job, they might have a wife and kids, but you have to accept that the cult took, some energy out of you, or some money, or some time, or whatever. So you have lost time, money, effort, love on something that was a complete folly, a complete waste of time. And I think for some people, I mean, I've known people who they might have even, they got something out of the cult. It's like, oh, the cult's really friendly, it's really focused, but at the end of the day, it's a lie. It's a lie. They can't prove that God exists. Therefore, all of this saving people, what's the point of that? Because they can't prove heaven, they can't prove hell, they can't prove God, they can't prove the devil. But that doesn't mean, you can't make something out of life. And that's my mindset now is, strip away all the false BS, and enjoy life. Some people enjoy going for long walks. Some people, I think for a lot of people it's like, right, okay, money. I've got to sort money out. But don't fall into all of these scams like I did. I left the cult. I saw an advert on Facebook for a free 2-hour Forex workshop. Yeah, that was a waste of 2 years and a waste of probably around 30-40 grand, that came to nothing. But when you're in a cult, or when you're hyped up by some scammy guru, whether it's self-help or trading or whatever, you're in that mindset and you have that worldview of this will work, this is the way to be, to save the world, to make money, self-improvement or whatever. You'll be in the hype. You'll be surrounded by other people with that belief system, and you're pouring money into it, you're pouring time, you're pouring effort into it, and it is BS, a belief system. And it doesn't bloody work. This is one of the things that amazes me about people, right? I know some people who go to church, but when you actually push them, and you dare not push them, it's like, well, what's the proof of God or heaven? You're really sort of digging in deep to the core of their belief, and if they just want it to be true, and you start questioning them, they'll feel that you're attacking them and what they believe. But, I'm one of these annoying people, deprogramming, exit counselling, asking the tough questions, is what are you bloody doing with your life? And what do you believe? And is what you believe actually getting you where you want in life? So you've got to dig deep. And, I think a lot of people are living in a bit of a fantasy. Society tells you, don't worry, everything will work out in the end. And that's not the case. Don't worry about anything, you'll be fine. People who say that, oh, don't worry. Well, actually, not worry, but understand. Understand you, understand what happened to you, therefore you can help other people, and it's not about ending up as a nihilist where you don't believe in anything and there's no point to life. That's bloody miserable. I know people who've gone down the path of nihilism, or atheism, in that there must be no God. I, as somebody who's an atheist, I'm very open-minded. I am very open-minded to, if, I don't know, aliens come to planet Earth or God shows up, I'm open-minded. I'm quite excited about the future because I don't know the future, and it really is like, I mean, if you watch these videos on my channels, you get to know a little bit more about me. But I am a person now in my 50s that I don't do surface level. I don't do surface level. I dig. You know, I dig and I dig and I dig. And it's like, okay, what am I going to do today? Why am I going to do it? You know, and hopefully there's enough time after that to actually get around and do something. But you know, everybody has their belief systems, and in psychology, we have our cognitive biases. So all humans have their cognitive biases, right? You can study this. We all have our fallacies that we believe to be true. You know, again, I mentioned one of them. Don't worry, everything will be fine. You know, well, things or things will get better. Don't worry. You know, these sort of cult phrases that the world uses outside of cults, but it's BS. It's a belief system. You know, I spend a couple of quid a week on the lottery. You know, I tell myself, well, you know, one day I could win. You know, I stand a 1 in 22 million chance or whatever. I could win one day. And then I kind of figured it out. If I buy a ticket, right, for Wednesday, I buy a ticket for Saturday on the lotto, 100 tickets a year, 200 quid, it's not a lot of money. Do that, 200 tickets, no, 100 tickets, sorry. And I do that for 50 years. You know, 5,000 tickets altogether, a 1 in 22 million chance. Yeah, pretty next to nothing. Pretty next to nothing. But the belief system likes to imagine, oh, when I win my £1,000,000, oh, I'm going to live here, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. You know, we like to believe that things can get better. You know, and this weekend, on Saturday, 14 people in the UK became millionaires. It's a fact. You know, and we like to imagine ourselves, well, that'll be me one day, I'll be. But do you know how many people played it at the weekend? How many tickets were bought? You know, tens of millions of tickets were bought. And out of tens of millions of tickets, right, you know, 14 people became millionaires. And it's true, it could be you. I mean, the odds are fantastic, you know, millions to one or whatever. But I did actually win 1 quid. I did actually win a quid. I've got 2 numbers. But, you know, people have a belief system that, yeah, I'm a lucky person, you know, and we have all these cognitive biases, and we're social, and let's be honest, we don't know how the universe came to be. We don't know how life came to be. So in many ways we're ignorant and we're optimistic, you know, and the deeper you dig, you know, into people, you know, when you learn about different people and what different people believe the most craziest things, right? And that's one of life's lessons. People will believe crazy things, and they'll live their life based upon what they believe, and their beliefs might change. You know, I was raised a Catholic. I had a Catholic worldview. Then I was in a Protestant cult for 20 years. I had a Protestant worldview that it was my duty to evangelize and give money and do all of that kind of nonsense. And then my worldview became atheistic, and I didn't really get much out of atheism, to be honest. But, you know, now my belief system is, well, I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded. You know, I'm interested in, as the Bible says, living life to the full. And that means trying new things. And some of the things you try won't work, and you'll learn that lesson. And some of the things you try will work. And I mean, for me, I do enjoy being around people who are hungry, not for the restaurant, but hungry for life. You're hungry for life. You want to do things, but you're not being controlled or deceived by somebody telling you this is the way the world is. The man behind the pulpit whose agenda is to make himself survive. Or the guru that wants to sell you a course so he can survive. The Forex scammer, or for people, the girlfriend that is just bleeding you dry, spending all your money and making your life a misery. Um, I am a strong believer in cutting off toxic people. You know, um, I don't cut off all the toxic people I know. Because some people they've got their positives, but they've got their negatives. I think we all have that. I know my negatives. Yes, I procrastinate. I procrastinate. I've got ideas. I start things, then I stop. Um, Maybe I'm a bit obsessed about talking about cults. But I genuinely feel that my belief in this channel and what this is all about is that people will watch it, people will relate, people will read books on cults or get exit counselling or deprogramming, and it will help their life. It will help them understand, them and what happened to them, and it will sort of toughen them up a bit, you know. And I mean, I've learned a lot from Stephen Hassan. Even though I've not actually met him, sat down and had a conversation with him, I've learned a lot from Rick Ross, Rick Alan Ross. I've read his books, so I've watched his stuff on YouTube, and it's really helped. And some people are in a better situation than other after a cult. Some people can afford to have a counsellor or a psychiatrist or whatever. But if you can't, and a lot of people can't afford, face-to-face access with exit counsellors, there are people out there like myself, ex-members who, I mean, even though I have actually stopped exit counselling now, I don't do the face-to-face anymore. Like, we're not going to meet up. I'm not going to get on a train to go up to London. It's quite expensive now, a sort of travel card from Reading to London. So I'm not going to do any of that anymore, because it consumes so much time. Let's so the last 13 years, let's say I get some time with somebody who's experienced the cult and they want to meet up face to face. Um, I used to be able to afford that, like get up, get the bus, get on the bus, get to the train station, have a cup of coffee, get on the train. Half an hour later, I'm in London. Maybe we could meet up at sort of Westfield, Shepherd's Bush, something like that, have a coffee, whatever, have lunch. I used to enjoy that, but I can't afford to do that anymore. Just everything's gotten so stupidly expensive these days. I mean, coffees, it's nearly £5 for a coffee. I'm still imagining life the way it was sort of 10 years ago. Go down Wetherspoons, 79 pence was it, or 99 pence, as much coffee as you like, a meal for £5 or whatever with a drink, and it's like, as somebody who's not working because of health issues, and can't get a job because of health issues, I'm sort of in the corner where, well, I really do have to do something. I have to do something, or otherwise I'm just staring death in the face. I know I talk about me a bit, but this is my channel. But it's situations change in life. One of my friends who was in the cult, he's getting divorced now. I mean, I remember him bushy, bright-eyed, full of zest for life in his 20s, evangelizing, thinking he was going to save the world. He became a leader in the cult, a Bible talk leader, got married because he recruited people. You don't get married unless you recruit people, so that's why it never happened for me. That was a painful realisation. But, the bloke, he got married, he's got kids, and now he's getting divorced. It's like, wow, how did that happen? And I've actually known a few people who, in their 20s, they joined the cult, they did well in the cult, they recruited for the cult, they went up the ranks, they got married, and now a lot of them are getting divorced in their sort of 40s and 50s. They're getting divorced, their life has sort of fallen apart. And so, it can take somebody years and years to realise that their BS belief system doesn't work. It doesn't work, And I think that's one of the tough lessons in life for a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong, I know people who got married in the cult and they're still married, and they've left the cult behind, but it's actually surprises me that the majority of people do actually end up getting divorced. And it can be because, they're reverting back to different belief systems, and then they're just not, they just don't love each other anymore, or they get on each other's nerves. And that's an awful situation to be in. I mean, I nearly got a girlfriend in the cult. And I actually met her after the cult. I'd left the cult, she'd left the cult, we met up again. Perchance we met on Facebook. And I thought, I still had this sort of fantasy of who she was. And then I got to know her, and she wasn't who I thought she was, because in cults, people always put on a face. In cults, people pretend to be friendly, but the more you get to know them, it's like, okay, you're another human facing life. You're not, once the makeup isn't on, once the gloss, when you see the person for what they really are, it's got to be based upon love rather than, what she looks like or how much money he's got. When you strip it all away, and you come down to the base human of who you are, a lot of people aren't who you think they are. Cult members, they pretend to be friendly because they're trying to recruit you. But what are they like in normal life? Strip away all the sort of religious delusion, and what are you left with at the core of the person? Who are you? Do you want to be a nice person? I guess I can thank my Catholic upbringing for, I want to be a nice person. But some people leave a cult situation and they revert back to, being a lazy drunk, sexually immoral, crooked. I've known people who've left cults and they've become rotten. But I've also known people who've left cults and they're a really nice person. Whether they're a believer or whether they're an atheist or whatever. And it's amazing, it's an amazing process of stripping away all the superficial. What I've noticed in life for me is there's people who are genuine and authentic, and there's people who are superficial, you know. Now, the superficial might come across as more friendly, more charismatic, more persuasive, but at their core, they're usually very selfish, very narcissistic, and not the type of people you want to be around. Con artists, basically. And every con artist, whether it's a con man behind the pulpit or a guru or whatever, you know, when you strip away the facade, it's not a particularly nice individual underneath. Because they're a con artist. Yeah? They're making you believe things that they can't prove. You know, that's why I can't do religion anymore. I can't do religion anymore. I've stripped away that BS because there's no proof. It's a nice little fantasy for people, but it's BS, you know. And this is the price you pay. This is the price you pay for digging deep. You know, you will find genuine nice people and you will find people that are just full of BS, you know. And I think that's one of the painful lessons in life, that, you know, young people are getting conned by trading gurus, self-help gurus, religious gurus, political gurus. Young people are getting conned, right? Conned, and they join these groups, they sign up to these courses, and it's just BS. It's just a belief system. There's no substance to it, you know. And you could say the same about, quote, quote, the real world. The belief system is you get a skill, you learn a trade, you get a job, and you exist, for most people. But there's so much more to life. You know, I mean, I feel for young people these days getting into 60, 70 grand of debt to get a degree, and their belief system was they'd get a job at the end of it. It's no wonder so many young people are very despondent. You know, it's like, oh, YouTube told me this, that, and the other. Or my friends told me this, that, and the other, and it was all a load of crap. Well, there you go. There you go. It's tough. It is tough. And there are a lot of people out there that will deceive you and scam you. So I find it no wonder that a lot of young people are despondent. They're despondent when they see con men like Donald Trump made $500 million from scamming people out of crypto, and the people who've lost $500 million. I mean, the idea is you trust the politician because they're out to make everybody's life better. You know, it's BS, you know, with a lot of them. Yeah, there's a lot of tough lessons in life. I mean, if you're fortunate enough to find somebody that you love and you love them, and you know, you do all right, you've got an income or whatever, good for you. Good for you. But there's so many traps along the way. You know, I mean, over the years of me not wasting my time, but just being naively drawn into things, you know. There's family that I haven't seen since the 1990s. You know, the career just got completely smashed to pieces. You know, I wish I had a happily ever after story. But what you'll find with people who've left cults, some of them have recovered, you know, and some of them haven't. What else are you expecting? You know, I think people think exit counsellors or deprogrammers or psychologists or doctors or whatever, they can just wave this magic wand and you'll figure things out and your life will be perfect. You know, for some people, yeah, it all helps. For other people, I mean, there's people I've helped over the years. Some of them have really done well, right? Other people that you try and help, it's like they don't bother returning the call. They don't answer to the email. I mean, I have a list of people, right? This is why I'm not exit counselling anymore. It's like maybe I'm getting older. Maybe I'm getting more skeptical. I don't know. But maybe I'm getting more realistic. That's why I don't use the word skeptical. I just say I'm seeing life for what it is. There's good people in this world and there's bad people in this world. Try and avoid the bad people. Try and be around the good people. It's not complicated, you know. Um, but of course, the bad people pretend to be good people. That's what fools us, you know, whether it's a girlfriend or whether it's a job or whatever. I've already covered that. But, you know, it's. I like to think I'm, you know, a positive. A positive. I like to think I want the best for people, which is why I do things like create these channels, explain how these con artists con you. They hate me. They hate me because they make a living from conning you, whether it's religious, whether it's political, whether it's money making. There are evil people who put a big smile on and they con you. And the results speak for themselves. Multi-level marketing, 95% of people fail. Religious cults, probably the vast majority of people leave within the first couple of years, yeah? Doesn't work, right? Self-help courses, 95% of people achieve nothing, you know. And it's a lie to say 95% of people achieve nothing in life. It's just a lot of the things you try won't work for you. You know, for me, I'm trying yet again. I got a degree in electronics. Me and my friend, we're going to try and start a business. You know, you need clients, you need a product, you need hard work. It's not complicated. You know, you need skill as well. But it is what it is. But you know, when it comes to exit counselling and deprogramming, you might find exit counsellors you resonate with, and you might find exit counsellors you think, well, this guy's a complete waste of space. I mean, I can only sing the praises of people like Stephen Hassan and Rick Ross, Margaret Singer, who's passed away. There's a lot of really good exit counsellors out there, but there's also, you know, I was in the ICOC and ICC. There's some of the guys that, you know, form ex-member groups. You know, they're just useless. You know, and it's like it's kind of sad that, you know, I mean, I'll be honest here. What I find most annoying with some ex-members, they've still got this cult mindset that they're still pushing Christianity. You know, oh, I'll exit counsel you, but oh, you're an atheist. Oh, okay, mate. Don't want to know you. Imagine doctors did that. You know, certainly in America, there's a lot of these Christian exit counsellors that if you're not a Christian, then they don't want to know you. You know, the good thing about people like Stephen Hassan and Rick Ross, you know, they might have a Jewish heritage, but they're not going to shun you, you know, if you're an atheist. You know, whereas some counsellors, unless you have the same BS belief system as the counsellor, you know, then they're not really going to put their heart and soul into helping you. Now, I've learned this lesson the hard way because, you know, it's like the worst thing, you can do for somebody who's experienced a cult is then try and push them into another church. You know, and I've known people in the ICOC, ICC, and they sort of say, oh, well, are you still going to church then? You know, and if you say no, it's like, well, that's the end of the relationship. And it's like, well, thank you very much for nothing. I, as somebody who has exit counselled for 13 years, the goal is for that person to be whatever they want to be. You know, if you want to be an atheist, great. If you want to be a believer, great. If you want to do whatever you want to do, great. That's the whole point. It's about you regaining what is known as the locus of control, so you are the captain of your own ship. I'm not going to tell you what to believe. I'll tell you what I believe. I believe maybe sometime in the future other life might visit planet Earth. Maybe. I don't know. Maybe they are like the gods. I don't know. I mean, when I tell people my belief system, the biggest thing I tell them is, well, I don't know. I don't know how the universe came to be. I don't know how life came to be. I don't know if there's life out there. I don't know if there's life that has evolved into gods. Maybe we will evolve into gods 10,000 years from now. I don't know. My belief system is I don't really know very much at all. I know there's evil people in this world, and I know there's good people in this world, and that's about it. You know, so that's me being honest. But, you know, if somebody wants to believe whatever they want to believe, who am I to tell them no? You know, I think obviously when it comes to cults, if people are believing in bullshit, then you have to tell them. The man behind the pulpit, he's just a con man and a hypocrite. You know, he doesn't have a bloody visitor on a Sunday, and he's telling you you're going to go to hell unless you convert somebody. You know, it's crazy, and they can't prove hell exists, or heaven, or God, or the devil. You know, I hope this video has been useful for somebody. I mean, today I just feel like talking. You know, I've got this on my mind. This is what I've experienced with exit counselling and deprogramming. You can help yourself by reading the books. These days, there's no excuses. If you want to get an hour with Stephen Hassan, you can watch one of his videos. It's not going to be personal. And if you've got the money, yes, you can afford a counsellor or a psychiatrist. I mean, I've been waiting since 2008 to see a psychiatrist on the NHS, and I still haven't heard back. 2008 I've been waiting to get some help. You know, where does all my tax money go? You know, it's like, where's the bloody doctor? And when you see the doctor, you know, that they got 5 minutes, and, you know, 5 minutes isn't enough to say anything. You know, so, yeah, we live in a world where even though we pour billions into the NHS, for a lot of people it doesn't work. You know, seems like all the illegal immigrants are getting first place in the queue. You know, what the hell's going on in this world? But there you go, that's life. Another painful lesson. The system doesn't work. As if you didn't know that. But, you know, I think when you see life for what it is, you do have to balance the positive with the negative. The system is corrupt, politicians are corrupt, and there's a lot of evil going on in this world. Donald Trump scammed $500 million out of people on crypto. I think that's pretty evil. Yeah, so there's a lot of darkness in this world, and there's a lot of light. I mean, that's stating the bloody obvious, but, you know, the longer you live life, the more you realise. And when I talk to a lot of my friends, we've all come to the same conclusions about life. You know, I talk to somebody who's 70 years old, you know, and if we're open and honest, yeah, there's a lot of crap going on in this world. You know, there's a lot of greed, there's a lot of corruption, you know, there's a lot of inequality, and maybe it's always been that way, you know, all the way back to the Egyptians. Inequality. Pharaohs building temples, well, they're not building them, are they? They've brainwashed somebody else into thinking a temple is, a pyramid is a good idea. Like, what the fuck use is a pyramid? I mean, skyscrapers. What's that about? Is that just narcissism? You know, we live in a crazy world with good and evil. There you go. 55 minutes to conclude that. But hopefully there's something in this video that is useful for somebody. Yeah, I mean, I just keep it real. My belief system. I don't know how the universe came to be. Brian Cox will tell you the same thing. He doesn't know, even though he's got a PhD. Life. You know, the world's smartest people who study biology and all of that, they don't know how life began. You know, religious people who will talk to you all day about God and heaven and the visions they have, and none of them can even prove God is real. It's so bloody ironic, isn't it? It's hilarious. You know. Anyway, that's me. I just felt like talking today. I was happy that England beat Mexico 3-2, and yeah, I just woke up today and I thought, yeah, I've got to talk about exit counselling. You know, I did say I was only going to create these videos at the weekend, but hopefully today, you know, I've used up an hour of energy talking about this topic, but hopefully I've got enough energy to read some electronics books and do other things that I want to do in life. As you get older, you have to realise that, you know, you're not 20, you don't have unlimited energy, you know, and with the energy and the sort of life you have, you know, you have to use your energy productively. You know, it's like I've done an hour today talking about a cult topic. So later on today, hopefully I'll do an hour electronics. But if I'm in the mood to do another video rather than the electronics, then I'll do another video today because that's what I'm in the mood to do. Anyway, you might see another video today, or you might not see a video till next Sunday. But I do want to go through this first principles and just prove to people beyond any shadow of a doubt that it is BS. It's a belief system and it doesn't function. It only serves the leaders. It doesn't actually serve the members. I mean, I've learned that. I've learned that I was brainwashed by a cult, the Kit McKean cults. I was deceived, I was used, you know, pimped effectively, just to get other people in and make the leaders rich. And they've got this fantasy that they call God that they can't prove, you know. And yeah, it's BS. It's a belief system, you know. And I don't like the fact that I wasted 20 years. I don't like the fact that a lot of the people I've helped out of the cult, you know, they've concluded, well, they wasted months or years just making some narcissist behind the pulpit richer. And that's how those devils behind the pulpit survive. They just give you a load of BS. And I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's a good thing that they can't prove God and then they threaten people with hell if you don't believe what they believe. I think religion is BS. It is a belief system, but there's no proof. You know, you could say, well, therefore you're an atheist. But I'm open-minded. I'm open-minded to, as I've said earlier, but yeah, for me, religion is BS. It's a belief system. There's no real reality to it. Anyway, that's 1 hour. Please like, please subscribe. I know this is more of a podcast than, seeing my face in a fancy studio. But that's not who I am. I don't have the money to, get all of that kind of bullshit. That's not what I'm about. But I'm not chasing the numbers. I'm not chasing the subscribers. Yes, this channel might not do very much, but it's passing on the knowledge. I mean, I've had some great conversation with people at bus stops. I've met some amazing people. I don't know whether they're angels or not, really, or aliens, but sometimes you just meet people and you have amazing conversations with them, one on one, and they're not getting million. I mean, you have a decent conversation with somebody down a cafe. Just because they're not the prettiest person or they're not the most charismatic person, that's what life's about. Meeting people, having conversations, living life. I mean, if I have a conversation with somebody, just to finish this video, I'm not going to say nothing unless 1 million people are listening. They say these supermodels, she won't get out of bed for less than £50,000. It's so sad, isn't it, that we live in a world where there's so many narcissists. They won't get out of bed unless you give them tons of money. Sad and pathetic, isn't it, really? But I know I'm never going to maybe get... It's a very specialised topic, cults. It's a bit like talking about 1960s trains from British Rail. It's a rather specialised topic.